Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Welcome back to the Power Trends podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lanahan, Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. Today, we're speaking with Karen Palmer, who is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Future of Power Initiative at Resources for the Future, or RFF. RFF is one of the oldest and most prestigious environmental think tanks in the country. In fact, upon its creation in 1952, it became the first research institution solely dedicated to the examination of natural resources and environmental issues. Karen's here to discuss one of our favorite topics, carbon pricing. Specifically, we want to learn more about RFF's independent examination of the New York ISO's carbon pricing proposal and what they found. As frequent listeners to the Power Trends podcast know, NYISO's carbon proposal was developed on the premise that incorporating the social cost of carbon into the wholesale markets for electricity is the most efficient way to create synergies between the state's ambitious clean energy and decarbonization goals and the competitive wholesale markets which the New York ISO oversees. We recently had a conversation with Sue Tierney of the Analysis Group about their examination of our proposal, and we'd like to hear some of the distinctions between what the Analysis Group found and what RFF found. Karen, before we really dive into some of your key findings, can you tell our listeners a little more about yourself, your background, and the work you do at RFF?
Sure. Happy to do that, Kevin, and really happy to be here on this podcast and speaking with your listeners about one of my favorite topics, which is carbon pricing. So I've been a researcher at Resources for the Future ever since I got my PhD in economics, which was, this is hard to say, but over 30 years ago. I work on issues related to electricity and the environment, and particularly climate change. And I've done analysis in my job here of most of the major climate policy proposals focused on the electricity sector in the U.S., including national, regional, and state policies. In the Northeast, I've worked on the RGGI policy, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, since before that initiative took off about 10 years ago. But my work on carbon and environmental adders actually goes back decades. And I also want to point out that I've been on the Environmental Advisory Council to the New York Independent System Operator since it was founded in 2004. And that's a great opportunity to both keep up on market developments in the NYISO and also environmental policies in New York State, which has been a leader in addressing the environmental challenges posed by the electricity sector. So, it's great to be here to talk to you guys about our work.
Well, it's our pleasure, and thanks for mentioning your work with our Environmental Advisory Committee. That's very important, and that background that you just went into is part of the reason why you were also invited to the House Subcommittee on Energy to talk about carbon pricing and when they held their recent hearing on solutions for a 100% clean economy. So let's dive right in. Your recent report, Benefits and Costs of Power Plant Carbon Emissions Pricing in New York. Can you summarize the findings in that report for our listeners?
First, I want to acknowledge that the study was a joint effort by myself and my RFF colleagues Dan Sean and Paul Pucciano. And what we did was we used our electricity sector model, which is known as it's called the Engineering, Environmental, and Economic Electricity Simulation Tool, or E4ST, EAST for short, to look at the effect of the New York carbon pricing proposal on electricity markets, which includes both the supply and the demand side, and emissions of CO2 as well as other air pollutants, focusing on the year 2025. In the analysis, we also explore interactions with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Program and with other New York state policies to encourage clean energy. And we conduct this analysis under two different sets of assumptions about renewables costs and natural gas prices. One that is sort of a midpoint assumption about costs for purposes of comparison. We refer to that here as the low case. And one, the high case, that is less favorable to renewables and more favorable to natural gas. So our chief findings, let me just give you a few of them. One is that emissions of CO2 from New York generators under this proposal fall by between 6 and 22% in the year 2025 as a result of the proposal. In addition, the proposal reduces emissions within the larger RGGI region to which New York belongs, and also actually within the entire Eastern Interconnect. In addition to addressing carbon emissions, the proposal reduces emissions of other pollutants, including SO2 and NOx, and consequently their adverse environmental and health impacts, both within New York and beyond New York State. And the impacts of the proposal on consumers of electricity within New York are really quite small, with price increases to New York consumers of between 0.1% and 1.1%, again, depending upon the underlying cost assumptions. Overall, we find that the policy has a net benefit to society at large of between $108 million and $651 million per year, again, focusing on 2025. And this benefit includes benefits to consumers and producers, impacts on government revenues, and also impacts on the environment as a consequence of the reduced emissions of CO2 and other pollutants. And it's a broad measure of the benefits to society going beyond the borders of New York State.
There are certain general similarities between the analysis group findings and the RFF key findings, but there are some differences too. Can you describe for listeners what some of those distinctions are?
I think the key difference between our study and the analysis group study is in terms of the methodology that we adopted. So we, as I mentioned at the beginning, set out to analyze the proposal using our integrated model that takes account of both changes in supply and demand of electricity and has a very detailed representation of the transmission grid within New York, interconnections between New York and all the neighboring regions. And so we could do a fairly detailed analysis that allows us to really look at impacts on nodal prices and prices within the various regions. Another way, I think, in which our analysis is different is we focus on interactions between the New York policies and the regional greenhouse gas initiative market, which we've studied extensively. And so there have been some recent innovations in the design of that program that we take advantage of in our analysis and contribute in important ways to our results. But there's also a lot of common themes of both analyses, and I'd say the main one is the focus on how carbon pricing can work with the market and provide incentives to all electricity market actors to look for cost-effective ways to reduce carbon emissions. And some specific common findings are, one, that the carbon price will help retain existing generating units with zero or low carbon emissions and keep them in operation. A second one is that a carbon price will support investment in new renewables, actually beyond that's required under the clean energy standard that's in effect currently until the policies designed under New York's new Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act come into effect. And it will encourage those renewables to be located in places where they have the largest effect on reducing CO2 emissions. And lastly, I would say that carbon pricing, we're both finding that carbon pricing will provide market incentives that are consistent with state clean energy goals. As Sue Tierney of the analysis group likes to say, both the clean energy goals and the markets will be rowing in the same direction under this proposal. And it's a great feature of carbon pricing because it unleashes the creativity and the power of the market to push for electricity market solutions that are consistent with the clean energy future that New York wants to achieve. And it will also help to get to those goals more quickly.
Karen, a question that we get a lot is how the New York ISO's carbon pricing proposal will work with or impact RGGI. Can you give us your views on that?
So this is a key reason that we were interested in actually studying the New York proposal is because of the interactions with RGGI. So as your listeners may know, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a policy that covers emissions from electricity sectors in a large region that extends from Maine down to Maryland, with New Jersey planning on joining back in just a couple of years. And Virginia is also expected to join prior to 2025. So in our analysis, we treated which focuses on 2025, we treated all of these states as being part of RGGI. And I want to point out that program has contributed to important reductions in CO2 emissions over time, but it's also less ambitious in terms of the price that it's likely to impose going forward than the New York proposal. So, important distinction is RGGI is a cap and trade program, so it focuses on a cap, while the New York proposal that we're discussing today focuses on the price. However, in the most recent program review that took place in 2016, spilling over into 2017, RGGI introduced a new feature into its program that's known as the Emission Containment Reserve, or ECR. And what that Emission Containment Reserve means is that companion policies to RGGI, such as a state renewable portfolio standard or an additional carbon price like New York is considering and has proposed, can have even greater environmental potency as they reduce the demand for RGGI allowances. And it means that those policies will have environmental benefits across the entire RGGI region. So it's an important feature, and it's an important way to make the ambitions of states within the RGGI region have greater impact beyond just their state borders.
And on that question, there is certainly some focus in New England and also PJM markets with regard to a carbon pricing proposal. Do you see the New York ISO's proposal as transportable into those regions?
One of the virtues of the New York proposal operating in New York is you've got sort of a geographic coincidence between the borders of the New York wholesale markets and the state border of New York to which state policies apply. So while operationally the pricing of carbon in wholesale markets could operate in any market, an important precursor to that happening is coming to agreement between state policymakers and the ISO on features of the policy, like what the carbon price should be, or if there's different carbon prices in different regions, how that would work. And those are the types of hurdles that would have to be overcome in designing such a policy.
There's been a lot of discussion since we put forward our proposal and the various different analyses that have taken place with regard to the speed of technology that a carbon price in the markets can incentivize. Is that something that RFF also looked at, bringing technologies that can help with the decarbonization goals that the state has set up through statute more aggressively?
In our analysis, we find that the introduction of clean energy technologies, particularly new wind and solar, does happen faster with the New York carbon adder than it would under the CES that's currently in place in New York State, prior to the one that's going to be any policies that will be developed to implement the new act. So yes, there is an acceleration of the bringing online of those technologies. I think one of the things that it's difficult to model is sort of the creation of technologies or discovery that hasn't happened yet but could happen. And that's one of the beauties of having a carbon price, is that it creates incentives for performance, basically reducing carbon emissions within the market. And so innovations happen in the presence of a price that aren't expected. The other thing I want to say about new technology is that the state has very aggressive goals, particularly in terms of the timing of getting to a clean energy sector. And I think unleashing new technology and discovery of new technologies is going to be important to meeting those goals. So having a carbon price out there and a carbon price that grows over time is going to provide incentives to do that and try to be a winner in those marketplaces.
Yes, so getting some of those nascent technologies we know are in the lab out of the lab into market, and carbon pricing can provide that healthy incentive and price signal that investors, frankly, are looking for.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's a really important component of making that happen.
Karen, there's always some discussion about the interchange, if you will, between the carbon price and the impact on the renewable energy credits and the zero emissions credits programs that the state has set up under the Clean Energy Standard. Can you describe for our listeners how that works?
Right. So essentially, by introducing a price on carbon into the marketplace, you create a demand for all sorts of forms of mitigating emissions. And at the price levels that New York is considering in this proposal, we find that the incentive to introduce new renewables to the marketplace and invest in renewables, and to keep the existing upstate nuclear plants online comes primarily from this boost to the energy market prices with the carbon pricing proposal. And at the levels specified, again, in the current clean energy standard, we essentially find that the price of RECs and ZECs falls to zero because the energy prices are doing all the work. They're encouraging investment in renewables, and they're encouraging investment in renewables beyond what both chronologically beyond because the policy extends into the future, but also even in terms of the quantity of renewables that are introduced into the marketplace in response to this carbon price beyond what the requirements are under the current clean energy standard policy.
And fair to say that this approach achieves the investment in the decarbonization goals while at the same time shielding consumers from investment risk.
Oh, yes, definitely. It transfers a lot of that risk to the marketplace and, as I said, provides these incentives to not only locate renewables where they'll have big impacts on emissions, but also I think could lead to important investments in ways to bring renewables into the market. For example, there's an abundance of wind resource upstate, and there's an abundance of electricity consumers downstate in New York, and currently there are transmission constraints between those two locations. And having this price of carbon in the market, activated in the marketplace, will provide important incentives to free that bottleneck and site some new transmission that will make it possible to bring more wind power downstate to mitigate climate emissions within the state.
That's that tale of two grids challenge that we talk about here.
Yes, yeah, definitely. You asked about indirect impacts of carbon pricing that we didn't really directly address in our report. And I guess one of the impacts that I want to mention is a virtue of aligning the incentives in New York's wholesale markets with state environmental goals is that, as we did discuss, it limits potentially the contribution of technology-specific subsidies that have led to controversies about the integrity of capacity markets in various ISO markets and associated calls for mitigation actions by the FERC. So applying a price to CO2 emissions from all generators in New York markets would reduce the role of these payments from RECs and ZECs in these markets, and therefore reduce calls for, or arguably the need for, market mitigation due to out-of-market payments to a subset of resources. Now, we didn't analyze this directly, but federal policy is that these mitigation measures are needed. Lowering the need for these mitigation efforts, which could prove costly to consumers, is another potential benefit of the New York ISO's carbon pricing proposal that I just want to highlight for your listeners.
Karen, that was a great discussion. We appreciate RFF's work in looking at our carbon pricing proposal. We appreciate your efforts on our Environmental Advisory Committee. It was a real pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much to you, Kevin. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to working more with the NYISO Environmental Advisory Committee in the future. Take care.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.